The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner. And I'm Dr. Bud Marr. As you can tell, that's not actually Bud. Bud is on the episode today, but we weren't able to have him here for the intro or outro, so I'm handling intro and outro duties. As we said, this is the Uncommon Good. So glad to have you with us here on Iowa Catholic Radio. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible. As always, underwriting the Uncommon Good, and that makes things special. I'm Bo Bonner. You probably know me from hosting the Catholic Morning Show here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud Marr, that's Dr. Bud Marr to all of us. He does all sorts of wonderful administration work for liberal arts and sciences over at Mercy College of Health Sciences here in Des Moines. Thank you for listening to Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good. Today on the show, we have someone all the way from France, but via Italy? Well, he's Italian. He works in France. He's my friend, and he was over here in the States. Dr. Luigi Russi. He's going to talk about Cosmotechnics, this a term that, don't worry, we'll explain it to you. It will make a lot of sense right in the sort of wheelhouse of our religion and technology segments. Dr. Luigi Russi, Assistant Professor of Education at the Catholic University of the West of France in Angers. He was a Newman Scholar at National Institute of Newman Studies, where Bud Marr was before, and then a member of the Lyceum Institute out of Buffalo. It is a wonderful conversation that you're not going to want to miss at all. Like I said, right in the wheelhouse of everything we've been talking about with religion and technology, so you are not going to want to miss it. Stick around. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. So happy that all of you are joining us here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Make sure to stick around. You'll be glad that you did. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. We're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients, who makes this possible for us. Imogene Ingredients, thanks for underwriting the Uncommon Good. Let's go ahead and get started with our interview. We have with us here in Iowa from France, although he's originally from Italy, Dr. Luigi Russi. He is Assistant Professor of Education at the Catholic University of the West of France in Angers. We've worked together in multiple occasions, very much so in this, the theme of religion, technology, and media. Luigi, thanks for coming on The Uncommon Good.
Thank you for having me, Bo.
We're very excited because what you wanted to talk about today is very much something that overlaps with many different things that we talk about here on The Uncommon Good. So we'll let you take it away a little bit. What prompted you to bring up this idea of, I'll leave it to you. What are we talking about today, Luigi?
So today we're talking about a concept called the Catholic Cosmotechnics, and we're going to try and unpack what that means. Maybe, I come to the question that you were about to ask me, which is, why do that, and why in this particular moment? And obviously, the fact that we have a new pope, Pope Leo XIV, is a big stimulus for everybody who recognizes themselves in the circles of Catholic thought to bring their own little grain of dust to the construction, and so this is my attempt to do that. To do what? There's widespread discussion, conversation around the fact that probably the next big encyclical that this Pope will be working on is going to be on the place of technology, and how the deposit of faith can nurture responses to or relations to technology. And so the idea of Catholic cosmotechnics is precisely a way of thinking about that. Well,
and on that word, let's go into that one real quick. So cosmotechnics, I think in some of it's applied, right? The sort of cosmology of technique or technology or things like this. But a specific thinker came up with it. So if you can just tell us who that is and maybe give us a grounding of what that idea is.
Yes. So the thinker in question is a philosopher of technology who is originally from Hong Kong. So he has a Chinese name. He's called Yuk Hui. I don't know if I've pronounced it correctly. And so he's published a lot of books, but the book with which he started this whole thing was called The Question Concerning Technology in China. And his position is that we often think of technology as some kind of a thing. And technology is fundamentally a cultural form. So he says if technology is a form of culture, so for the listeners, what that means is that, for example, every time you open your computer and use the desktop, what you see on the screen is not literally your desktop. It's a metaphor that programmers have introduced to help you think about what you might do with interact with the computational processes of the machine. And when you start looking about it in this way, many of the things we use in technology are metaphors. Mm-hmm. ChatGPT as the nice assistant that is helping you. So technology is actually something that is that is part of a wider network of cultural practices. So once you say that, you say, well, then there might be different ways of doing technology based on immersion in different cultural practices. And so what Yukui did in this essay is he said, well, what would be the Chinese way of thinking about technology or, technological development, the use of technology, the value of technology. And so he argues that for what he calls technodiversity, so the importance of foregrounding these different culturally mediated relations to technology. However, he basically dismisses all of the West, saying, it's Eurocentric, so let's look elsewhere. And I want to say, not so fast. Mm-hmm. Actually, there are different. There is a certain plurality in the West, and so the idea of a Catholic cosmotechnics would be within the Western canon. There is a tradition of actually a living tradition that is incarnated in the practice of the faith, and then elaborated philosophically. I would put it this way. And what questions might we ask to this tradition to be able to orient ourselves and find a relationship, to develop a relationship to technology and engineer different kinds of technologies that reflect that relationship in order to enter this century. And so that's what I would like to offer to the ongoing debate.
Yeah, and in this regard, right, and in one hand, I should say, I'm already imagining all the ways I'm plagiarizing your idea in my mind.
Great.
Right, mostly because I think this is like just a really good way to talk about what's been sort of bubbling, not only on our show, but in the sort of discussions our mutual friends and colleagues have in mind. But what you're essentially asking is there a Catholic Cosmotechnics?
Yes.
And what you've thrown out is, well, the liturgy might serve as, if not like the Cosmotechnics itself in its practical application, the sort of background or foundational way in which we have, as it were, techniques to approach the world.
Yes. I think I was dissatisfied with framing these questions from the start as ethical questions, because I feel like the weakness, obviously, to frame it as an ethical question foregrounds the ability to choose, which is a value, it's important. However, it discounts the ontological question, meaning the question of what is actually there. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to bring that question back. I find that it's a very good strategy today to think of the entities with which humanity relates, whether this be the environment and the agency of rock formations and geological deposits, or whether this be the computational processes of the internet. So I wanted to find some ontological traction, something that could allow me to speak of presence, of being, and in an almost happenstance way, I came to the idea of entering through liturgy, and what my entry point was a book by first finding the writings of Alexander Schmemann, mm-hmm. who actually was an Orthodox theologian, and then the works of David Fagerberg from the University of Notre Dame and Aidan Kavanagh, who established sort of the liturgy program at Notre Dame. Basically, their claim is that, as I understand it, that the source of theology is the liturgical experience. So it's the presences that you meet mm-hmm. in the liturgy, and theology serves to put words on that so that you can access it consciously and understand it. And so what they try to reframe is the idea that liturgy is a sub-discipline of theology, and theology sort of runs the show. They say, well, actually, it's probably the contrary. So if you want to understand what are existing ways and practices that you can look at to ask them questions about how might we think about technology, you would probably want to revisit the multimedia experience ante litteram, which is Mass and cathedrals and the architecture of cathedrals, music, everything. And so that's where I'm at.
Yeah, well, so on one hand, immediately what I think of is Alistair MacIntyre, the great ethicist, points out that the practices that we do comport us towards reality in such a way that we can then evaluate ethics. So as an ethicist, right, that ontological, like what is our stance, our comportment, our attitude, the way that we relate to reality itself already begins to fundamentally shape how we answer things ethically. So I think your intuition's right, that you just don't sort of like start with ethics. Ethics itself is about what do we believe is actually real and how do we believe we relate to it. But, Bud, I want to turn to you because, specifically, I have in mind that this is, in the wheelhouse of things you've brought up multiple times on The Uncommon Good in this last year when we've made the emphasis about religion and technology, is that precisely if liturgy is the sort of wellspring in which our theological considerations stem from, that very comportment, that attitude, that sort of stance we're going to have towards the world in the technological reality that we keep talking about, I think that's informed a lot of the ways, both of us, but you specifically, that's what you've brought in many ways to our considerations here.
Yeah, I've been challenged by the idea that I think you mentioned that you started with an Orthodox theologian in some of these investigations. And in the West, I think, unfortunately, things have developed in such a way that we see maybe like the scripture and the creeds as elements of tradition, but the liturgy is not always thought of in those terms. And so I think someone like Schmemann, he challenges Westerners positively in that respect.
Yeah, I agree. I found very helpful to look at the writings of David Fagerberg because he's moving within the Catholic horizon, and I've actually found. This might surprise you, but for somebody who is arguing that liturgy is actually a very helpful way to think about some questions of technology, I wouldn't say that I have thought about the liturgy a whole lot in my practice as a Catholic. And what the critique that Fagerberg makes of what has happened to how the liturgy has been transformed over the centuries, as it has assimilated certain media and marginalized others, it has changed the experience of what it is to be in liturgy today. So my experience of being in liturgy has often been, of standing up and down from the pews, the homily somehow sometimes feels like the most important part of the liturgy, even though it's not. But then when you think about it, there's a certain textualization of, the texts taking over the liturgy. And so what Fagerberg's work has allowed me to do is to actually begin taking a sort of a critical approach, not in the sense of a deconstructive approach, but just sort of being able to understand the genealogy of, the better understanding the tradition, that has preceded my presence within the church, and understand how some of the feelings that I may have or experiences I may have within the liturgy are not just idiosyncratic or, a failing of a particular, of my own devotion or something, but actually thinking maybe they show me something about what the liturgy has become. And it offered me, it helped with the kind of forgetfulness we were talking about earlier today. What was the experience like? How did my grandparents experience going to church? And, the last thing I'll say is that I've started thinking that, I recently had this experience of being in Genova. Genova was a town with a sea republic. And so it had many sailors and religious communities coming from the east. And it was also a city that has many Baroque churches. So I entered into a Baroque church, which had, sort of stone and then gold, just tons of gold, but gold that's like coming at you. So you're meant to feel almost quashed, overwhelmed,
Accosted.
or accosted. It's almost like saying hi. It's almost like somebody greets you at the door and says, "Hi, would you be interested in?" And then I went to a church that was more hidden, which is a sort of an Eastern Rite Catholic church, and obviously there was this experience of icons that were. There wasn't necessarily a clear center. There was an icon on the left. There was another icon facing me, and somehow there was something that my attention was wandering between all these things, and it was in that moment that I said, maybe the fact that my attention is wandering here into all these things is not bad. It's actually how it's meant to be. That's what being in a church is meant to be this experience where you begin to wander, and in that wandering, you paradoxically find or are found. So anyway, this is how the reading, undertaking this work has begun personally to make me think about how my own inhabitation of the liturgy.
Well, one thing I think Catholics in the United States sometimes struggle with, like the different social contexts, is that liturgy, as it's sort of developed in the last 50 or 60 years, almost takes on the form of like television media.
Yeah, and so I've ruined people's life with that.
Obviously, there's another author, Martin Mosebach, and he says like one of the unfortunate sort of like elements of modern culture is that a lot of us, because we've read about the liturgy or we're sort of cognizant of the changes, we can sort of sit back and critique things. Whereas I think in some parts of Catholic history, it was a more immersive experience. It wasn't like something set apart from the rest of life. It was connection with the transcendent, but I think it had a different, the faithful had a different sort of comportment in the context of the liturgy. When Bo and I were at Protestant seminary, a couple professors loved this quote by Karl Barth, where he said, like, we had to enter the strange new world of the Bible. I feel like there's a challenge today where Catholics have to enter the strange new world of the liturgy. I'm not sure what that means, because the temptation is to keep kind of like tweaking the liturgy, but it seems more about how we sort of like celebrate or enter into it. And that leads me to an actual question. I don't mean to be opining here. We've talked a lot on the show about how there's these different, like some people, when they're faced with the looming sort of like challenges of technology, there's the Luddite response, right? This new technology is creeping up, and as the faithful, we just have to sort of like reject it or resist it. It sounds like you're thinking through Cosmotechnics. It's calling from us a different sort of like relationship to technology. Could you unpack what that looks like?
Yes, I think the idea that I'm working on at the moment came to me when I was in Conques, which is a Romanic church on the Camino de Santiago, the French part. And what's peculiar about this particular church is that there's little faces popping up everywhere. There's under the is it called the capital of the columns? Under the capitals of the columns, at the bottom of the columns, and they're fashioned in different ways. There's dogs, there's things that people would have been familiar with, and so I thought to enter a medieval church is to experience participation. These things are looking at you, you're looking at them, you enter a space where something is already going on. So the question that the liturgy, in a way, you are joining a liturgy that's always been ongoing. And so the question is, how do you comport yourself in this already ongoing work that is done by many different presences? I mean, and also in the Middle Ages, there's also angels, everywhere. So I think, how do you inhabit this ontology, one could say, this world where there are presences that are glorifying God, but that are also participating in a work that isn't there because God created it. And I'm thinking, for example, how does that apply to technology? I think the way it applies is that I feel like there's some. It could change some of the questions we ask, particularly, the Luddite response. We call large language models today artificial intelligence. Now, that's a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
To call it intelligence implicitly poses the question, is it human intelligence, or is it going to take over human intelligence? And then it gets people into saying, well, we should maybe stop it, go back, we should forget it, we should unsee it, we should, flash ourselves like Men in Black and
Mm-hmm.
forget it forever. And I feel like actually what I'm realizing is that there have always been many intelligences that we reckon with. And I feel like, a foil for this would be the environmental question. To take the environmental question seriously today is to realize that we've never been alone. We've always been observed by natural processes that were accumulating the traces of our greenhouse gas consumptions. And at some point they respond, but they respond in their own time, which is not ours. So, 200 years later, something's changing that we thought would never change. So I feel like we have always been immersed in presences that listen to us, that respond to us, that we can learn to listen to. And so my question, what I'm trying to understand is, large language models, but essentially the computer is a computational machine. So the logic of the computer is, binary information. It detects patterns. It can do stuff. I feel like when, for example, I would say, yes, it listens to speech, but it listens to speech like a machine would do, not like a human being. So they can detect patterns in your speech, but they don't necessarily apprehend your intention, which is something that you have because you're a body, you're trying to reach certain ends. So I feel like, how do we, instead of saying, well, is it good or bad that, somebody is listening in 1 and 0 to my speech, is, well, what are they hearing and how can I hear their hearing, and can we do something together? So in a way, what I really like about the term liturgy is that, well, it has, the etymology is translated in different way, work of the people, service. And I like this idea that it's a common, I translate it for myself as a common work. The liturgy is never the work of somebody. It's not an anchorman doing something. It's a choral assemblage in which an ethos of service and participation allows the experience to happen. And I feel like I would say that at the heart of a Catholic cosmotechnics would be the idea that we are to be liturgists when it comes to technology. So we have to ask, how are things created, not by us using technology, but by us and technology interacting in dialogue together, and how can that dialogue that is already occurring be for the greater glory of God, as the Jesuits would say, but be a way of a form of thanksgiving for a gift that has been given to us.
Yeah, as we reach the end of this segment, I think exactly that idea of not willing to write off entire aspects of the world as in a sort of Gnostic dualism, right? That you have, this is why I even worry about people talking about virtual reality, or like you need to be in reality and not like the reality on, online or with AI. Few things are more real now, right? Like it is really the case that like the digital world and artificial intelligence, so-called, is impacting our life. It's the same way when people go like, you need to be in the material world and not the virtual world. And I go, look, the material outlay of artificial intelligence is actually one of the pressing ecological problems, right? There's actually few technologies we've ever made that has a bigger footprint in terms of the material world. So the question starts to be not being able to lop off stuff or throw it to the side or anything like that. Like you're saying, the question starts to be, how would someone formed by the cosmotechnics of the liturgy look at what we're doing with artificial intelligence very differently, press it, like we don't have to like just accept it as it is to do whatever it wants, but how do we take that formation that we have and, as it were, impute that form onto the new emergent technologies? This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Budmar joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We're on to our second segment with our guest, Dr. Luigi Russi, who is the Assistant Professor of Education at the Catholic University of the West of France in Angers. He's worked at Newman Institute of Newman Studies, Lyceum Institute, also many different projects that we're doing together. Luigi, thanks for coming on the Uncommon Good.
Thank you for having me.
So to keep rolling along on this idea of a Catholic Cosmotechnics and how the liturgy might form what we mean by that, just a real quick reintroduction in case you're catching this late in the program. Cosmotechnics is sort of the formative approach we have towards technology itself. What's the philosopher's name again? I'm sorry.
Yuk Hui.
Yeah, Yuk Hui, who has developed this in terms of China and then sort of made a comparison to the West. But we're saying that the West is not a monolith itself when it comes to how it comports, leans against its stance towards the world. And so what if the liturgy is the way for Catholics to understand their cosmotechnics and how we might engage the world of something like the text? And so, I think with the liturgy, Bud, we were bringing up, the sort of television mode of the Mass since 1970. That's something that we given talks about. I'd like to point out to people that one way to look at the architecture of a church, if you remove the pews, which really does give this sort of sit and listen or watch, the sort of architecture of a church is like just a bunch of hyperlinks in one way, right? That if you keep pressing, if you keep your attention to look at these different ways, it's like you're pressing a hyperlink that follows down the bunny trail of more grace, more different ways of pointing that out. And so the idea starts to be, if that's the sort of formative experience, if we can, so to speak, unleash the sort of total cosmotechnics of the liturgy, rather than maybe ways that we've sort of narrowed it, that maybe that then would give us a robust way to then start looking at technology and the new technologies itself, and not simply have to be reactive, not simply have to be Luddite, but actually the form that we've been informed with by the liturgy, maybe we can impress that form on the upcoming technologies. So, obviously the philosopher that came up with cosmotechnics, but you're bringing up in the break here, E.F. Schumacher maybe is someone who can help us sort of show how that also comes to life.
Yeah, because, the question underlying all this is, if we're talking about cosmotechnics, we're not just talking about an idea of technology, but I'm trying to also dig ways in which this can be put into practice. Mm-hmm. So if we took the liturgy seriously, how would we then do liturgy in the wider world with technology? So how would we act, how would that be designed, and how would we think about it? And so that's where the question gets tricky. And I'm describing some of the paths I took. And one path that I took is the work of E.F. Schumacher. E.F. Schumacher is known for a book called Small is Beautiful, mm-hmm. and he's often portrayed as somebody who applied Buddhist philosophy to mm-hmm. technology, which is true. But what is also true is that later in his life he became a devout Catholic, and so some of the ideas that he is describing in that work have also been taken up within the church. But I feel like they require some translation, because obviously the idea of small is beautiful implies this duality between small and big. And I feel like this, to some extent, is harder to apply to a technology like AI, for example, because AI is obviously trained on enormous data sets which are collected with technologies where that can elaborate, that can keep traces of the footprints you leave as you're using all kinds of apps or the internet. But then once they're trained, once they have their parameters set, you can interact with them on very practical matters. You can. Yesterday, somebody took me in a self-driving car, which is trained on data sets, but then it's turning the corner here in Iowa, so it's turning a very specific corner. So I feel like the small being the local and big being something that is outside of the local. I feel like this maybe is not so helpful. So I started asking myself what might have been Schumacher's intention in advocating for small. He was writing about sort of particularly industrial agriculture at the time. So industrialized agriculture, fertilizer and so on. So not run on the fertility of the field anymore. And I think he also had another concept, which is that I think of spiritual misery. So what if you've seen, and I think we're in Iowa. So if you've seen farmers struggling with debt, because most of the stuff they need for their farm, they have to buy. In order to buy it, they have to sell their crops. In order to sell their crops, they have to standardize them, and they have to sell them to very large players that can extract a lower price from them. So they find themselves having to sell their crops at decreasing prices, and having to buy implements, which the prices of which do not often decrease. So this is a kind of deadly treadmill. And agriculture, which has the word culture in it, becomes an evil toil. So how does this spiritual misery come about? And I think in relation to technology, what I've been thinking is that humans have meaning for humans is inherent in social. It's socially constituted. We understand meaning. According to some educational thinkers, we first understand meaning when we or develop knowledge when we see it played out outside, between people. First I have a conversation with the teacher, then I don't need the teacher anymore. I have that conversation within myself, and I've internalized the skill. So the question is, how do you keep that alive? And I feel like, the way that something like an artificial intelligence makes meaning is through reading patterns, statistical patterns, because one of the things that language does is has statistical regularities. However, what it cannot appreciate is the sequence, the elaborate sequence of translations through which what is initially an intention becomes a question, becomes an answer, becomes a proposition, becomes common work. And the way I think about it sometimes is through the metaphor of a plant. A plant is made up, expresses many organs throughout its life, beginning from a seed. And the plant is not the aggregation of all these organs stitched together with blue tack, but it is the living process that expresses all these things. And I feel like meaning for humans is this living process that has a kind of continuity across different subjects. And so the way I explain this to myself is then by appealing. So I feel like anyway a technology. So just to not go too far and maybe make a pause here. So one initial principle that I would say would have to do with with preserving this character of meaning, and I feel like that. That means that it's not this aspect of meaning creation cannot be done by a machine, because that's not how a machine thinks. So this will have to one has to be maybe more careful in looking at how it is becomes assembled with a machine, but to keep in mind how do you tend to that. So that maybe is one form of attention that one can give. And then there's a second prong where I rely a little bit more on Marshall McLuhan, but I'll pause here.
Well, I mean, one of the first things that I think of is when you talk about small versus large, people will be right, is like, how on earth could you ever imagine artificial intelligence as small? But I think this is a general problem you see in technology in the digital world that continuously gets proven in a very concrete way. And it's this: we are always prone, because we have technology now, where you can do like a lot of stuff with one thing of technology. So, in the past, when Og had a shovel or a hammer, like Og can't make shovel hammer. He doesn't have the capacity. And so Og, the caveman, doesn't run into the problem of trying to be too large. It's like, this tool does this or not. Is it a fulcrum? Is it a shovel? Is it a hammer? But as we go along, we start to try to like make technologies that solve all things. And so general GPT, general AI is absolutely scary because for multiple reasons. One is it blows past subsidiarity. It sort of overwhelms us because it seems like it can do all things. You know, artificial intelligence seems like it's alive, not because it actually is, but because they're basically making like the open Google search that can talk back to you. But if we can like be very specific about things, then we get if we make technology where you go, its goal is to do this one specific task, then the sort of like dignity of the human, its interaction with that thing starts to be different. So, for instance, not to like product place on here, but there's these things called Remarkables, and all they do is help you write. That's it. And people are like, oh, well, why don't they go get on the internet? Or why don't they like receive text, messages? Why don't they? And the whole thing behind Remarkable is like, no, when you get on this, you're going to do one thing. You're going to write. And in a world that's full of distractions, right, this one piece of technology that does one thing really well is precisely small is beautiful. It's doing this one small thing. AI can do, like you said, miraculous stuff. It's going to be able to help us drive better. It's going to make us like deploy fertilizer better in fields so we don't waste it and cook there's all sorts of things that can help. I actually think general AI is the problem, and technology that's supposed to solve every problem is it's too large and is going against, like you're saying, the small is beautiful. And that starts to be, I think, like you said, about this human way that like human knowledge grows like a plant. It slowly grows rather than just gets slammed and like downloaded all at once. I still think this goes to the liturgy itself as well. The liturgy is not like 5 minutes of intense formation in God. The liturgy has this warp and weft that takes time and forms us because it's time entering into eternity. It allows us to like shape our souls and form our souls rather than just be a download of information or accomplishing a task like, boom, I've done my God worship time. I don't know if that, yeah.
Yeah, and as I've been listening, we've been dealing a lot with like the philosophical structure that you've been working on. When you think about places or persons who, what I actually have in mind is practices, like folks who are navigating the waters that we have in view, but doing it really well.
Yeah.
Like, where in the world do you see Catholics or others sort of like doing creative things along the lines of what you have in mind?
Well, for example, one of the, the first time I started thinking about these questions were when I participated with Bo at the Catholic Digital Media Influencer Summit. And in my assessment, there were roughly two types of participants. There were participants who were producing Catholic content for the algorithm. So that's what being a digital influencer meant for them. And then there were Catholics who were thinking about rewriting the algorithm, actually, or thinking why do we even think that, for example, the smartphone, which is it's a metaphor, it's the personal device assistant. So that's a metaphor again. That should be your entry point into something of faith. Could we maybe rethink that metaphor? Maybe think that the smartphone is the entry point into a community, and then at some point the smartphone goes away. It participates with this community, so you have this idea that it enters a common work, but it moderates itself. And so this is where I started thinking, we need to rethink the way we design technologies. What does that mean? And that's where we come back to the idea of cosmotechnics. I think to design technology is fundamentally a poetic activity or a rhetorical activity. It involves metaphors. That we have used a lot of metaphors, and what the metaphor does, it's a sign that shows you, that allows you to notice an affordance, something that you can do with a machine, in a way that you can do something with it. And what's interesting is in the history of interfaces, for example, there are ways in which the metaphor gets overdone. So when the first laptops, when the first operating systems were developed, the desktop is a spatial metaphor for a computational process. So there were certain iterations of software that Microsoft was doing. I read this in a 1990s book where they actually really pushed this spatial metaphor kind of way too much. So they tried to put your living room on your screen, so that they would then think, how do I reproduce the living room and put stuff from the living room in the metaphor, even if it doesn't lead you anywhere.
Right.
So there are ways in which the metaphors, in a way, take hold, capture your imagination, and they take over, and they interrupt this idea of participation. And I feel like in the liturgy, for example, I'm reading a book called The Elements of Right by Aidan Kavanagh, which he's inspired by The Elements of Style by White and Shrunk. And so what he's saying, for example, is that he says he has interesting guidelines, one of which really struck me. He says, in church, you don't have a soloist who sings, because a soloist who sings implicitly says, I am the singer, you are the spectator. And that's when the metaphor, that's when the solo idea of solo performance becomes misleading. You lose sight of what you're actually there to do. And so I think what a Catholic cosmotechnics would entail is actually not something primarily technical, but something primarily rhetorical and poetic, which is, how do we develop metaphors for the affordances of technology, which are very useful and very powerful, but in ways that keeps them participants in a work that they are not meant to centralize, which is what you were saying earlier, but that they're meant to facilitate. And I think this is the question that's...
Well, I think with what you're getting at there is a great example of how the Luddite option is different than what you're sort of talking about. You mentioned when I first met you that you had spent time in Pittsburgh at the National Institute for Newman Studies. And I don't know when you were there, but they've got a great project going on where they're digitizing Newman's handwritten manuscripts.
Yes.
And so if there was just a total rejection of the digital, that sort of project would never happen.
Yeah.
For parents or others who think like, well, if my kid gets involved in this, it's just going to be negative in his life. I think what they're doing there is actually introducing a lot of young scholars to a broader range of the Catholic intellectual tradition through the digital. And what's fascinating is their main tech guy, Danny Michaels, shout out, his first sort of project in this vein, his dissertation, was taking the Basilica in Assisi and making it interactive online so that a person could kind of like do a virtual tour of the Basilica. And then you could narrow in on specific parts of the architecture and sort of see a greater unfolding of that. But I think that's an excellent example of someone who's sort of like taking the digital and like working within it, but sort of exploding the categories that are supposed to constrain.
Well, I mean, this is something Luigi and we gave a joint talk, the Internet as Classroom, where we were pointing this out about, and this is where I think this is where like we've already been doing this, Luigi, you're just putting words to it, right? Because what did we do mostly in that talk? We talked about how dangerous some metaphors for the Internet were, and that they weren't actually accurate. And so like the Internet as a place is a very actually unhelpful metaphor. And it's funny, right? Like not only did like you're pointing out like when Microsoft in the 90s had it like, oh, there's my couch. I was thinking of files, right? Like files aren't real. File is a metaphor from a file folder. And then files, of course, came because like, what is that, Filio or whatever, like the actual pages from a book. And so anyway, like you keep seeing how this metaphor jumps until we act like, oh, actually human knowledge is a bunch of files that I store in the file folder in my head. And you're like, absolutely not. That's actually not how your memory works. And neuroscience is proving that's not how it works. It's a metaphor that has too much sway. Well, the same thing with the Internet as a place. It's really worrisome to call us digital missionaries because that means we carry over a lot of like of a lot of baggage of Catholic history into somewhere that is just a metaphor that only works or it doesn't. And, we were talking about, like, maybe it's more like a digital fog or, like, we need to have a digital observatory, right, that we're looking at. So I think what this gets at, right, is those formed by the Cosmotechnics of the liturgy, one of the first things we need to do in this world is, like, call out metaphors that aren't working for technology and refuse to allow them to become, or push back at least, to become the dominant metaphors that are the problem that I think people who are inclined to Ludditism are rightly worried about. If, like, you have a talking robot that can market any idea to your child and just overwhelm them with its seeming ability to talk, that's a massive problem. But it's not talking. This is like, you were saying, like, what's intelligence, right? Like, one of the things I always try to point out to people is it's not really actually artificial, and it's not intelligence either. It's prediction. It's like a gambling machine that you hit the slot machine, like, lever, and it comes out and it predicts really well, but it also, every third or fifth or eighth time, tells you something completely wrong. And it has no way to know that because it doesn't know anything.
Well, to demonstrate that metaphors really matter, what's funny, so the reason I think the digital project at NENS right now really works is because there is something archaeological about investigating the Catholic tradition.
Yep.
Yes.
The original idea for the Newman Institute was to have like a virtual Newman that you could pose questions to, and he would like answer it sort of like an encyclopedia. And I don't know, like maybe they could have pulled that off better or worse, but what it kind of gives people the impression is that learning the faith is kind of like learning like a set of facts or something. Whereas this other project, I think, is more open-ended and more interactive in the best sense of the term.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. This is absolutely fantastic. We'll have to fly you back in from France sometime to continue this. But real quick, before we let you go, if people are interested in your ideas when you fly back over the pond, how can people here in the United States keep track with what you're doing?
Well, you can follow. I actually have a pretty low profile, but I have accounts on ResearchGate and academia.edu where I post my work. This is still ongoing, though.
We also have something on together, right? The Vortex of.
Yes, that's right. The Vortex of Beginnings, which
That's
is it's a little blog that we have in France. And I would just like to acknowledge one thing before we close, which is. You acknowledge, obviously, Danny Michael's work at NINS. Some people whose work I found really inspiring because they really explode the metaphors in a very creative way are two designers from Washington, D.C., from the See What's Under studio.
Oh, yeah.
Their work is actually very fascinating in terms of how it's able to ask... to really go at the heart of the metaphors that a technology involves and explode them.
We're going to get those two on at some point as well. So
Great.
Shout out to those guys. But today we spoke with Dr. Luigi Russi, who is Assistant Professor of Education at the Catholic University of West of France in Angers, and a great friend, and wonderful to have you on the Uncommon Good. Thanks for coming on, Luigi.
Dankeschön.
You're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So glad that you were able to join us. Thank you to Imogene Ingredients for underwriting the Uncommon Good. Thank you for being such a wonderful sponsor. And if you guys need help with your cattle's feed needs, I think you know where to go. Imogene Ingredients. Again, Bud couldn't join us for the outro here, but I think that we have plenty that you can digest and chew on. An interesting way, to say the least, about considering religion and technology, and hope you guys had fun, as much fun as we did, considering those issues. Speaking what Bud usually points out, you can join our prayer life here on Iowa Catholic Radio. I'm just going to highlight a few. For instance, the Holy Rosary at 4:30. We have Rosary at different times throughout the day. You can also hit the Divine Mercy Chaplet that starts at 2:57 p.m. and finishes right at 3 before we go into our other programming. You want to make sure to find out what's going on in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area. You just go to iowacatholicradio.com, click on events, and you can see the interesting things that are coming up. We have the big one, Iowa Catholic Radio's Men's Stag, coming up September 3rd, 5 o'clock out at Country Lane Lodge. I'm still thinking there might be some raffle tickets you can buy in order to get a $2,500 Scheels gift card. So you might consider that as well. Also, always keep us in prayer and prayerfully consider maybe donating. 515-223-1150 or go to iowacatholicradio.com. Click on the donate button for a safe and secure way to keep this ministry happening. Folks, again, wonderful time with some good friends. Thank you for listening to the show. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.